Action online RPGs and action-based MMORPGs have been a staple in the industry for many years. Sure, there hasn't been very many of them, usually being more costly games to make and produce and being a bit more ambitious, but with games like Guild Wars 2, Black Desert Online, Phantasy Star Online, and Vindictus, and more, action online RPGs have actually been pretty well represented in a market where tab-target slow gameplay was largely, early on, the most popular. But despite some of these positive attempts, there is a graveyard of some not-so-successful attempts, which is what we focus a lot on in the Death of a Game series, a series where we investigate the largest contributing factors to the death or dying of a game or company by navigating a timeline of events that are filled with clues and bits of evidence. This culminates in a final deduction where detectives, get their kind of moment in the sun where we crack the case for good. RaiderZ, developed by the creators of Guns, a third-person online PC shooter part of internet royalty and history. RaiderZ would launch in 2011, but after just a few years would start to see shutdowns in its home region of Korea, followed by the EU, and finally the US servers being shut down last. Although RaiderZ arguably had better combat than any of its competitors and was one of the best-looking games on the market, for the time it's been a rather forgotten MMORPG, and those kinds of MMORPGs are extremely intriguing to me, and hopefully other detectives watching the series, because they just feel like they're a story waiting to be told. An MMORPG with full action combat, custom classes, and a skill-based PvP and PvE boss system, RaiderZ was supposed to be a serious contender on the market supported by their powerful publisher Perfect World Entertainment. Instead, we are just moments away from covering it. Choose your base class, detectives. We have another MMORPG case to solve. The investigation begins with the Seoul, Korea-based video game developer Made Entertainment, coming off the larger-than-life success of their Guns title. Well, maybe not to the extent that some people are used to watching now, with kind of bigger blockbuster hits, but Guns was a part of internet royalty and history, and if you were there, you know what I'm talking about. It was just a game that everyone knew about, or had heard about, or seen a clip about at some point. It was that it game that wasn't WoW or the more mainstream games like EverQuest and so on, but was known nonetheless. Guns might not have been the big success financially it could have been, and if you want to find out why, check out my Death of the Game episode on it, but it still gave Made Entertainment enough success for them to pursue not just a sequel to Guns, but a new MMORPG featuring some inspiration and ideas from the Guns series, and its engine of course. This title, announced to the world at E3 2011 in June, would be dubbed RaiderZ, or Raiders, whatever you end up calling it. Utilizing an upgraded real space engine, the same engine that Guns used, Raiders was not actually about raids. I know, strange, and I learned this when I visited their booth at PAX later the next year in 2012. But regardless, it was a game clearly bent on borrowing heavily from the Monster Hunter franchise, a game that is closer to an online action RPG, a famous genre in the Japanese market. But it was about monster hunting and action combat, which they would release in their first official trailer in November of 2011, titled in full, RaiderZ: The Art of Combat, which was a nod to the fact that the game would feature an active action combat system that hadn't quite really become mainstream yet. Though it should be mentioned that Terra Online, another Korean competitor also featuring an active action combat system with the focus on monster hunting, had launched earlier in the year, and Terra would go on to be quite successful at its start, and likely serve as stiff competition for Raiders from the beginning. But Made Entertainment this time around had teamed up with some serious publishers and weren't self-publishing to help with their global presence and strategy, teaming up with European game developer and large publisher Gameforge, and NNA teaming up with none other than Perfect World Entertainment, which is actually a branch of a Chinese mass media company, Perfect World, a company with over 4,500 employees. Now, while Gameforge's reputation wasn't exactly squeaky clean, it was a far cry from Perfect World Entertainment's, which is kind of funny because it has perfect in the name. It was largely known for their game, Perfect World International, which had tons of classic pay-to-win and cash shop items featured in it. This gave them quite the negative reputation, a reputation they would only continue to enforce with new MMORPG launches exhibiting the same sorts of strategies. I mean, they even got known for putting microtransactions into the Torchlight series and working with other titles rife with loot boxes and more. What I mean is that them being announced as the publisher was actually a negative for Raiders and NA, as it would keep players wary before they even tried the game. Oh yeah, it should be noted that actually the trailers used throughout Raiders, and honestly talking about opening trailers, teaser trailers, information-filled trailers, really just the trailers and media in general that was created for RaiderZ as an MMORPG was really good.
price of immortality is eternal suffering. No single warrior can withstand me.
And it kind of makes me sad and miss some of the old times where, MMO and online RPG development and advertisement was a lot more effective and seemed to be made by people who actually understood what gamers like us were wanting in these sorts of games. Anyway, alpha testing for Raiders would begin mid-March 2012. This build is most likely the build that I would end up playing just a month later at PAX East, and I will describe my experience with Raiders as I encountered it. Now. I was unaware of who they were, but of course I knew who Perfect World was, so I knew it was an MMO. And I didn't know anything about what the game was about either, but the booth wasn't really insignificant, and it was enough to catch my eye. They were also peddling free t-shirts and other goodies to those who would play the game, which was a good idea because, well, it worked on me. What I was greeted with was, in my opinion, quite the surprise, with a game that had a better combat system than Terra Online and many other MMORPGs even today. The combat in RaiderZ, as I'm gonna switch between these names for some reason, was good and dynamic. You could block, dash, and jump, and your auto attacks were actually aimed and could cleave. The game was classless in a sense, where you would actually pick a base class, which we were able to do by, choosing one in the demo, but they were actually scaled up in level and power. Of the options, you had Defender, Berserker, Sorcerer, and Cleric, which seemed pretty generic for sure, and were, really, but they allowed you to combine skills from different trees and classes later on, which could actually make for interesting builds, like a Battle Mage, a Paladin, or a pure ranged Sorcerer Archer. Tab targeting wasn't really a thing in Raiders, something that Terra would sort of meet in the middle on later on, with all attacks being directional. You had to actually aim carefully to hit your target. Utilizing the same engine that the gun series used, the combat in Raiders was fun, especially once you started to take on the bigger bosses and bigger challenges. These bosses were almost designed like Monster Hunter bosses, with weak spots, but even giving you the ability to wield fallen parts of them. Raiders would actually buck a lot of MMORPG trends, looking more like an MMORPG instead, especially after I played it, because it would basically remove things like player crafting and make it more about actually gathering resources from killing monsters that you would then take to NPCs to craft your gear. Other outlets like PC Gamer would agree with my assessment, as they would say in their preview of Raiders, that players familiar with the original Monster Hunter game, that Raiders takes heavy inspiration from, will immediately be familiar with the core gameplay hook. But there were some signs even early on, as you can read in the impressions from video game media before RaiderZ's launch, where nearly all of them would also, like me, complement the game's graphics and gameplay, but not much else. There were some cool ideas there, but they seemed about puddle deep, such as the concept of actually being able to play instruments and them having some level of buffing, or how monsters dropped unique weapons you could use, something made famous in games like Guild Wars 2, another action online RPG, but these systems were just unfortunately done better in these games that I just mentioned, and like the game I mentioned, or even including the instrument system in Lord of the Rings Online. Being quite a common occurrence even these days, Raiders would first launch in Korea, months before its launch in the West. The problem being, Korea's MMO and online RPG scene was run by their titan developer and publishers, Nexon, NCSoft, Krafton, Smilegate, Pearl Abyss, and a few others, and many of these developers had competing projects with Raiders. This meant just relying on being an action combat game might not be enough, and that seemed to be the case, as because although normally I can check with my KR sources or research and find bits about the scene there concerning a game's launch there first, especially if it's Korean, there's not much of any information given about Raiders' launch, not even advertisement, which tells me they were likely outpaced there quite strongly by competition. Not having KR success was tricky for any KR-based video game developer who largely, like Japanese developers, relied on their home markets to enjoy their products the most, to make the most of their money. If Might wasn't able to succeed with Raiders and KR, that could mean that even their Western launch could be in jeopardy at a later date. Meanwhile, Terra was backed by Krafton and Nexon and would likely have upwards of triple the budget of Raiders by my estimates. The closed beta in the West would happen August 10th, 2012, and would allow much more than the 10,000 players invited during alpha testing to play and test the game. Raiders was the perfect sort of testing game, meaning that you could really never have the expectation applied to it for long-term things to be shown yet, and thus whatever was shown early on would actually look and play quite well. Now, I'm being a bit vague, but I'll explain shortly. Within a month, and the game was playable to all during its open beta, October 26th, 2012. The same time, they would also start selling founder packs, which were like pre-orders that came with the game copy and special incentives in the game. The base model was only $10, and the full version was a whole $60, which was like a normal priced game. which would offer even more goodies and the access to another upcoming Perfect World Entertainment game, Neverwinter Online. But these were extra, as the game was ultimately free to play. RaiderZ would launch in the NA and EU November 2012. This was around 10 months after Terra had launched and about a year after it was first playable in the world. When RaiderZ did finally come out, many of the early signs about the title were right. It lacked not just content, but simply just other things to do besides monster hunting, which you did again at the endgame on harder difficulties, which would only take about like a week or two to reach, which might not sound like a bad thing except that was the extent of your things to do. At launch, sure you could hit level 35 rather quickly, but once you did, the only thing you could do at max level was like duel people, monster hunt a little bit more, or do one of the 5 dungeons in the game. Meanwhile, Terra Online had 10 dungeons, plus battlegrounds and instance PvP, raid deathmatches, guild vs guild, and more. The PvP with the great gameplay in RaiderZ was actually quite good. You can see this in the few PvP clips available. Utilizing a chaos and order system for different towns for each zone, allowing for factional PvP warfare, something that Arcade would actually later lift and borrow from. The problems with the PvP systems were just them not being finished. There wasn't really much to do or gain from the PvP in the game, and no progression besides just getting better at it. Combat-wise, the idea of hybrid classes also ended up being quite problematic, and likely would require separate from PvE balancing to tackle. PvP was just chock full of wonder heroes or heroes and players who could just do it all. Heal, tank, and DPS. Suddenly the idea of letting everyone do everything backfired heavily, and thus, the PvP in RaiderZ was great fun, but not much of a boon to the game overall. RaiderZ just offered far less immediately, and wouldn't likely be able to keep up with the production that Terra Online would be pumping out, or their dozen other competitors, whether direct action online RPG competitors or just other MMORPGs in general. Because 2011 to 2013 actually had quite a few launches for RaiderZ to contend with, and it was already faltering at its launch. But all reviews really just acknowledged the elephant in the room, or elephants, that just about everything was lacking. Yes, fighting monsters was fun, but not nearly as cinematic or engaging as a Monster Hunter game, and the questing wasn't very good at lifting the rest of the weight either. Quests in RaiderZ were so forgettable that you would spend more time skipping through them than remembering them, and the voice acting that happens throughout them, oh my god, it sounds like a talent show band who's just happy to be there. The story, if you want to call it that, is just about a king in the lands of Rindel deciding that the new overabundance of monsters that came from some major calamity must be terminated, and thus this is the premise of the game. This is explained in opening trailers and information released about the game. After creating your actual character, nothing is actually shown to you. You're just ported to a city with no cutscene and no introduction to the world that you just entered. This might give some survival game players a hard-on, or even some old sandbox players, but sorry, for people who actually expect their game to have content, this is not what they want. The reason this stuff matters is because when the story and world of an online RPG aren't good enough, players aren't willing to forgive things like the content woes or other common issues in online RPGs, or even the more massive ones. That's why there is so much of an effort put into the production of games like Monster Hunter or Phantasy Star, in terms of the visuals and media, and a big focus on the game being about the journey to defeating bosses, and not just rushing to some end, which is more commonly expected in games like MMORPGs. The monster hunting concepts themselves are deep in Monster Hunter, which RaiderZ wanted to model itself after in many ways, yet they didn't actually copy the depth, an important part of the game's charm and feature set. Monster Hunter is not just focused on making their game work with more players online. Monster Hunter is just more about monster hunting. And it's also not really focused on trying to give a bunch of players online the chance to play a game, so that gives them the edge in the presentation and the gameplay smoothness. And if you wanted to go the other direction towards MMORPGs, well, RaiderZ couldn't compete with all that was in Terra Online by comparison either. The Christmas event that started December 11, 2012 would introduce a snowman invasion to the port city of Engen, and introduce a new special quest that is accompanied with a special instance featuring the Ice Queen boss. While this might sound like a fast content release, remember that the KR release was actually back in the summer. That means that even if this was made at some point in and released in KR, it took nearly 6 months for it to come to the new regions. RaiderZ was a really cool container, filled with some totally mid food that you lose interest about halfway through eating it. But the first expansion that dropped April 3rd, 2013, 5 months after the Western launch of RaiderZ, would launch dubbed Broken Silence, and introduce a new level cap, a party system, a new battle PvP arena, a new region, the Cowan Marsh, and more threats littered throughout. The Broken Silence expansion wasn't a bad expansion by any means, and it was a good value offering. especially for free-to-play players. But that doesn't necessarily translate to good business and is oftentimes a problem with free-to-play games. Since they can't really make their money up front and usually don't sell you expansions, you now, in this case, lose another way to monetize your audience. Which might sound cool and all, but as the population starts to shrink more and more, you have to up your monetization strategies aggressively lest the game ultimately fail. Worse, RaiderZ wasn't the only thing in trouble. Might Entertainment not only had a cancelled MMO, they would ultimately fail to capture much of an audience with the sequel of their biggest hit, Guns. This meant that now everything was riding on RaiderZ, a game that actually only had 2 mounts by the way. And that ship was already sinking. Within a year of the original KR launch and 8 months after the Western launch, RaiderZ in Europe would be shutting down. Gameforge would be honest about the reasons concerning the quick shutdown, stating that the success of RaiderZ did not meet our expectations as we saw no other potential alternatives to the discontinuation of the services. Unfortunately, we were left with no other alternative than to take this step. That means, as they said, Gameforge had no viable alternatives besides just shutting the game down in Europe. The KR launch might have fared better than the EU launch, but seemingly not by much, as RaiderZ there would face the same fate, just months later, shutting down in August of 2013. NeoWiz, who was now reportedly in charge of the KR version of the game, would report that they would be shutting down the game in the following month. Not much more was said from the KR perspective regarding it, but the parent company Perfect World would come out and start promising more monsters, zones, and dungeons for players to enjoy to come to the game, with the call to rally behind the last remaining server in the world, the NA servers. This promise would be fulfilled, with a new update dropping a year after the game's Western launch, November 14th, 2013. This update would introduce the Assassin class, a personal favorite of mine, and not just because it has, in the name, and now in its RaiderZ iteration, was like a high-flying, fast-moving, lethal dagger wielder. Problem being that that was basically it. There wasn't a new zone or new monsters. Meanwhile, Terra was adding like 2 major story progressing dungeons every year on top of the other bunch of quality of life changes and content. And more action titles were dropping by the year, with Elder Scrolls Online, despite its bad combat, is quite popular even still, launching just a year later. The money was likely drying up for Might Entertainment. They were going to need to do something big to fix it. This would come in the form of a Steam release January 15th, 2014, which was able to boost the game's population up to a few thousand now. But all the Steam release did was just start to highlight more of the problems in the game that had been plaguing it from the beginning of its launch, and one that I kind of intentionally kept in the dark so I can do like the classic mystery reveal later on. And that was the cheating and botting problem in the game. Upon logging into the game, you're met with tons of players already starting to spam you with whispers asking you to buy gold from them, or even their websites. It's overwhelming and annoying, especially in a game that's based on teaming up with other players to overcome challenging bosses. And even if you block them, well, they still have AFK botters and farmers running around the map, and mob stealing, which was actually a thing in the game, so you actually had to compete for your mobs with robots. Ultimately, many of the players who would join and review RaiderZ on Steam would echo many of the same concerns as previous players, years before, showing that the game had made very little progress positively forward. But worse, there were more complaints. A buggy crashing game, a game without much population in it, and now calls for the game just feeling outdated. While the shutdown of the last server might not have surprised many, including those watching now, it was surprising in how it took place. Before the game would actually shut down, its developers, Might Entertainment, would cease functioning in the summer of 2015, reportedly having sold their intellectual properties to another Korean developer, Masongsoft Incorporated. While this might have sounded like they got an extension on their future, potentially, as we will start to find out later, Masongsoft wasn't all they were cracked up to be. August 7th, 2015, and one of the most unique and ambitious action online RPGs or MMORPGs would shut down for good, with its final NA server croaking in the distance. The final words of Might simply being, they were no longer functioning. And just like that, the developer behind the 2 most interesting online RPGs ever was gone. Masongsoft wasn't though, and would promise a reimagining of the game November 2017, something they would also promise for the Guns franchise as well, as we would cover in our other video concerning that. Masongsoft would promise a lot though, but have their statements riddled with lack of confidence and clear inexperience, saying they were still exploring the many things that they hadn't yet looked at to improve the game, which sounded ominous, and that they would promise better and better experiences without much specifics yet. Microsoft would update a few months later, with some of their ideas for reimagining the game, such as the advanced combat, the open class system, whatever these things meant, because both things already existed, and then there was a passive skill system, trial instances, and then item and quest renewal and replacements. They also seemed quite conscious of the microtransactions and monetization of the game. Now, so these ideas weren't bad, especially the last one, but so far they were just ideas, and ideas are like that thing that Assassin has in the name. Everybody has it. We have to see more of it to actually rate the idea properly. Video games are like experiments, especially the virtual ones. It's not about just having ideas, it's about executing them in a live environment. Microsoft's combat changes were apparently just removing the invuln frame from dodge in the game. Yep, that was it. And footage was even released showcasing this, but the game now looked even older. I mean, it was, right? It was like 6 years older. And these apparent changes and UI changes and character creation updates were cool, but like the aforementioned evade change, weren't going to be big enough changes to bring any sort of attention to the game. And this idea that some companies or fans with just too much spare money have of taking old virtual worlds and trying to redo them is just faulty by nature. This only really applies if the game's reasons for failure were smaller, or more about like miscalculating certain levers. It's incredibly hard, if not impossible, to reintroduce people to a world and game they already left, like expeditiously. We have seen it in Final Fantasy XIV and Rift, and those games made these big comebacks, but like barely anyone else. It's extremely rare. Once your first effort fails, it's usually bottled. Years would pass and no announcements were made, and no game was released. The commercial career and future of RaiderZ might have been in the ditches, but the game still had private servers actually available for the community to play as early as 2019, which was a year after the last Microsoft major update of the time. 2 to 3 of them too, Revolution Raiders and RaiderZ Global/Legend, which seem to now have been merged. For me, community servers being erected are a sign that a game did have some potential to it, but just faltered in a sense. It shows there was some quality to this incomplete world of RaiderZ, even if the game had some of the worst voice acting I have ever heard.
Thanks to you, the crawler's seal broke easily. Tian will be killed by the crawler that I now control.
RaiderZ would get one last life, seemingly, when it would be announced that RaiderZ mobile game was in production. Mobile games based on old virtual worlds was in vogue, and honestly, I support them. And they were making millions, so who cares if I support them? So the idea of RaiderZ being featured on mobile devices was actually interesting to people like me, with how action-centric the combat was. However, this announcement would be like a post in Ghost, because 4 years later and there's not a single update about this mobile project from the developer Soul Games, or anyone else really. The last update we would receive concerning RaiderZ was dropped by Microsoft May 2022, with promises of a revamped storyline and quest system, and some revamped terrain as well. But these updates were starting to sound like this was just like a passion project for Microsoft, and they had no intentions of actually making money with the IPs that they paid for some reason, who would do the exact same Post and Ghost approach with the Guns franchise on multiple occasions. So RaiderZ on PC or mobile is seemingly dead for good. But luckily the community has banded together on multiple projects and is still working to keep this piece of internet gaming history alive. So people like you guys watching now can have the chance to see if all my hype about this game is even warranted, and thus how difficult MMORPG and MMORPG development is. So please make sure to check out those community servers I mentioned, that are also in the description, for a chance to play the game, since so many seem to have missed it. But the music is playing, detectives, and the timeline has now come to an end. We have covered, officially, a dead game in the Death of a Game series. Huzzah! Hooray, angry commenters. But like many of the other literally dead games we have covered, RaiderZ still lives on community servers. But officially, commercially, and however you want to call it, RaiderZ was shut down over a decade ago. And if you've made it to this part of the video, congratulations. This is the final deduction. This is the moment that I can crack the case, which is really just for people who perhaps missed any of the clues along the way. So I'm going to remind you, why did RaiderZ die and find itself on the Death of a Game series? A lack of content and a well-rounded content package, poor management, cool ideas without much further follow-through, tough competition, the parent company just ceased to exist. The Death of the Game series is a post-mortem series largely, covering games that died or are dying, or in cases like this, games that died but kind of were misunderstood. Maybe the general public didn't get a chance to try the game out the first time around, or maybe like with RaiderZ, it was just lacking an overall strong package. Package. There could be dozens of other reasons though, and that's why I just love doing this series, so we can cover interesting titles like this one and try to diagnose the largest reasons, not always getting every single one of them. And hopefully I can show you throughout the storytelling that being interesting or good at just a few things as a video game isn't really the best approach for an online RPG. Thanks for watching, and let me know in the comments below if you had a chance to play RaiderZ in the short time that it was out, and what your thoughts were about the game, what you liked or didn't like, and maybe any reasons you think I missed concerning why it ultimately failed commercially. Until the next case.
We call ourselves the Saints.